Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 90 of the Wool Circle. My name is Rebecca, and I am joining you from Rankin Inlet, Nunavut, in the far north of Canada. We are blazing through our year of color with great momentum. So today I wanted to take a pause and a step back and look into some of the work that we've all been doing, especially with color wheels. Believe it or not, we're coming to the end of our first quarter of the year. I can hardly believe it. We've come so far already. So let's get started. Color wheels are so attractive to look at and so addictive to make. It's so much fun to take a small amount of color, blend it up, and see where it goes, see what it makes. It's thrilling to see those blends come together into that never-ending circle of gradation, no matter what primaries we're using. Last episode, I shared an RYB color wheel with you. Well, not quite RYB, kind of RY. I swapped out the blue for more of a cyan color. This week, I made another small color wheel for this episode using quite different textures and primaries than last time. Again, I was shuffling primaries between CMY and RYB. If you remember, last time I used a red, a yellow, and a cyan and work with proportions until I got a really smooth gradient. This time, for the yellow and magenta, I used highlighter colors. The magenta is a super saturated hot pink, and the yellow, I don't really know whether to call it warm or cool. It seems very middling to me. For the blue in the same fiber, I didn't have enough of any one blue, so I worked with what I had. I blended together a very cool, dark royal blue and a tint of the same to get this nice middling blue that is definitely not cyan. I blended them together proportionally, just like I showed last episode, with secondaries from 50-50 blends and tertiaries from 75-25 blends. I didn't add any more to make a smoother gradient because I just didn't have any extra fiber. I'd been doing 2-ply samples for something else and found that it was really fun and didn't take that much longer than doing singles, so I went ahead and did 2-ply samples for this. Because of the rough nature of the roving and it had lots of neps in it, I knew that I'd get lots of big dots of color no matter how well I carded the fiber together, so doing a finer 2-ply also got that little bit of extra blending. The roving was just begging for a long draw, so I carded them into traditional rolags and did supported long draw. It was just perfect for this fiber. Here is what I got. Oh, my yellow is hanging funny. There we go. I think what defines this color wheel is really the highlighter nature of the primaries on the warm side and the super calm blue on the blue side. Wherever there's even a little bit of yellow, it just glows through whatever it touches. And when it's just the pink and blue, the pink is glowing through the blue. The greens are really what pull it together for me. If you took out the purples, you'd still have something that looked kind of balanced. And like if you took out the greens, you'd have this kind of crazy, like really intense Lisa Frank thing going on, and that would really take over. The pinks would just take over. Maybe I think that because I'm biased towards the greens, but I really think that the greens make sense of this color wheel for me. Just take a look at these two color wheels I made together. I slanted the new color wheel in this picture so it would match up with the old one because it's not as much fiber and not as many colors. And I think the differences really jump out in this picture. In between the reds and yellows, this area is a more traditional CMY on top and RYB on the bottom. The CMY oranges are very citrusy and lean towards the magenta because I didn't compensate for the dominance of the magenta. The RYB oranges are very warm and fiery, even though the yellow is paler. On the cooler end of things, the differences are more obvious. On the bottom half, the red and cyan make a mauve, and the pink and blue on top really struggle to blend well, but they still make a clearer purple on top than below. The paler yellow down below leads to more muted, sagey greens, while the brightness of the yellow up top really jumps through and brightens the blue. Now that my work is out of the way, let's talk about you. You guys all jumped in from the very beginning making your own color wheels. I want to look at some of your color wheels together with all the different primaries you guys used so we can see what we can learn from each other's work. I'm going to start with Amanda. This is Amanda's color wheel that she completed and posted in the Spinning Staplers group back in January. She was working from purchased dyed fiber from a large dye house, and here's what she says. Yesterday, this is back in January, I spent some time mixing secondary triads. I'm using an RYB co-primary palette, so 6 primaries. She has a warm and cool of each primary, but they're all RYB. It is lovely to see the prismatic and the muted versions of the secondary colors in the fiber blends. The difference between the two versions are quite striking, particularly between the greens. So to explain a little bit what's happening in this photo, the secondaries that you see on the outside that are sticking out, so like the orange, green, and purple that are sticking out, those are made from the primaries that are closest to it. Like the purple, for example, is made from the cooler red and blue that are closest to it. The secondaries in the middle, like that duller purple, are made from the red and the blue that are farther away from each other, that are almost across from each other. So they're leaning away, if you will. All right. This next slide shows the same colors photographed differently to show which primaries made which secondaries a little bit more clearly. In each photo on the left are the two primaries closest to each other, or leaning towards each other, as Amanda put it, and on the right are the two primaries leaning away from each other. Again, like Amanda said, the green is particularly striking. You can see how different they are. Okay, this is still Amanda. She says, here is my RYB earth toned palette with mixed secondaries. So she started with the very earthy red, yellow, and blue and got even earthier secondaries here. Many of us, I think, really love these colors. I would wear that rainbow in a heartbeat. I love it. And just for fun, she says, because I didn't plan on a CMY palette, but in the random lots I managed to get a cyan blue and a neon pink, aptly called Shocking. Here is a neon CMY palette with mixed secondaries, true highlighter colors, for sure. I find this highlighter color wheel so interesting because you can see how much more muted the secondaries are, even though they're so bright, just by virtue of being blended. They are more muted than the primaries. To get really highlighter looking secondaries, it would be much easier to dye them rather than blend them. The primaries are totally colors that my kids would wear, but I really like those secondaries. They're really nice. So moving along to Dion. Dion dyed her own fibers to spin her own color wheel. Like Amanda, she did 2 of each primary, but she did 2 each of the CMY colors rather than RYB. And she combed and dizzed these fibers together. So here's what Dion says. While thinking about dyeing for my color wheel, I wanted to use the dyes I have on hand and add a true magenta and cyan. I know I'm drawn to the CMY color wheel, so this is where I started. My first pick is my main CMY palette and the blended secondaries. These colors are Dharma Caribbean Blue, Deep Magenta, and Brilliant Yellow. And her second set of primaries is here, which again is Dharma. The colors are Frozen, Pink Orchid, and Jacquard Yellow. So the pink and the blue in the second set are both lighter in value, and the yellow is warmer and darker in value. The third picture is all of the secondary blends that I made mixing both primary wheels, Dion says. Okay, this is super interesting. I love the huge variety of secondary colors she got here. The power of temperature is very evident. So take the greens, for example. As you look at the greens on the top, the green farthest to the left and 2 away from that, second from the right, those are both made with the golden yellow, which is warmer. So it leans away from the blue, making green, and that makes the colors more muted. The other 2 greens, the one on the right and the one second from the left, those were mixed with the brilliant yellow, which is the cooler blue, and they're so much brighter. So the 2 mixed with brilliant yellow are brighter, while the 2 mixed with golden yellow are duller. Over on the purple side of things, look how massively different those purples are. The top 2 are with the Frozen cyan, which is lighter. It's so light that it doesn't compete as well with either of the magentas, while the bottom 2, the Caribbean Blue cyan, is much stronger. So this last picture puts everything together. Dion shares, and the last pick is both color wheels together and their secondaries. I've learned that even though I don't need both wheels, I do have a record of some of the mixes I love from the second set of primaries, so I can recreate them. Next, I want to do tones and shades of most of these colors. Oh my goodness. What a wonderful, rich palette. Great job, Diane. Okay. This is from Alberto, who shared these pictures in the Ravelry Year of Color thread. Alberto shares, I was able to complete my yellow to cyan portion of the fiber color wheel to present. I'm not as gifted as others, he says, who takes awesome pics of their work and trying to get the full color wheel in fiber at 36 samples at this point. Alberto, your pictures are wonderful. He says, I am shocked at how quickly the color changes with such a small amount of color added. My samples are 1/10 of an ounce. These fit on hand cards easily and are easy to store and reference. As noted earlier, I'm doing 0.1 increments from one color to the next. 0.01, excuse me. So each of these samples is 0.1 ounces and, 1/10 of an ounce. And he's changing up 0.01, and he's changing 1/10 of that in each direction as he goes through his color wheel. The next up, he shares his cyan to magenta combination. Pretty simple, from 0.01 to 0.09 measurements to end up with a 0.1 ounce sample. He says, sadly, I had to order more fiber, and I have included what I got, which differs significantly with what I had. Hopefully, during my visits to the local festivals, I'll find my cyan again. I ordered from a national seller and Etsy and got the same disappointments in cyan, not really cyan, and yellow, lemony, and light. I may be nitpicky about the magentas, but I did use real money to pay for them. This led to an interesting discussion in the Ravelry thread about true primaries. It is really easy to stress about having perfect primaries for experimentation, but you get to decide how nitpicky to be. Alberto knew exactly what he wanted from his cyan, and he posted later that he was able to achieve that cyan by blending a couple others together. That is a perfectly valid and excellent choice. It's also a great choice to work with what you have or what you can find, because there is no one perfect hue that defines a primary. At the same time, there are real definitions that we can learn more about. We can live in both of those places at once, learning more and refining, but accepting that good enough is good enough. Finally, Alberto says, okay, the last leg of the CMY color wheel. With it being overcast, he says, I didn't pick up on the green tint to the pure yellow fiber sample, but I have 2 other picks that don't show it as tinted green, and if I had switched the color alignment, I think the magenta would have held its own. I think what he's talking about here with the yellow, I can see what he means with it looking a little bit greenish on my screen, but I don't think that detracts at all from the clear, beautiful color gradation he's achieved here. Okay, I'm going to disappear for a moment from this last slide so you can appreciate the full glory of Alberto's CMY color wheel. While I know he wasn't super happy with his cyan, I think what is really interesting about it is how not dominant the cyan is that he used. Look at how balanced that yellow to cyan section is on the left. Normally it would be much harder for yellow to compete with cyan or blue. You know, you tend to need more yellow to really compete with the blue, but it's really, really balanced, and those gradations of hue are really fantastic. The yellow is very strong or dominant, and look how well the yellow competes with the magenta on the right. And in the center, you can see how much stronger the magenta is than the cyan. All 3 of the primaries he chose are very true, and you can see that in how bright the whole color wheel is. There's not really any muddying. It's all very, very clear. The clarity of the colors really shows through. And I especially love how many subtle gradations he got with those yellows. So amazing job, Alberto. Here's Dominique, again posting in Ravelry with her 2 color wheels. The 2 color wheels side by side, same yellow and cyan blue. On the left, magenta was a primary, and on the right, red. Unfortunately, the picture doesn't show well those red and magenta. For me, the wheel with magenta has a more interesting color progression. And then she says, I carded all the comb wastes and got a mud or brown color. How cool is this? She made these 2 color wheels and changed only one variable. I can see what she's saying, that the differences between the 2 reds, between the red and the magenta, isn't super obvious if you're just looking at that, but you can see a huge difference in the secondaries and tertiaries. On the right, with the red, the oranges are really warm, almost glowing, and the purples went in a very mauve direction. On the left, she got a more clear purple. I'm definitely seeing a theme here so far that if you want a clear purple, you have to go in a cooler direction with your red. Magenta gets clearer purples. And I do love that little sample of mud in the middle. All right, next we have Jackie, who is Fred and Sissy on Ravelry. She actually made this way back in January, but allowed me to share it with you. And I've included a picture of the primaries she used from her stash up top. Way to go, using your stash. Jackie says, I started with the oranges because orange isn't a color I love, but I have a feeling that tints of orange might be lovely. I misunderstood the color balance comment in Color and Spinning and started out with 18 grams of my precious red with 9 grams of the yellow to make what I hoped was an orange. It's definitely more red orange. From there, I rethought and blended extra yellow into batches to get 2 more yellow oranges. I then replicated the formulas that I used to make purples and greens. I did, she says, a 1:1 ratio of the 2 primary colors for each secondary color, and a 2:1 ratio of the 2 primary colors for each tertiary color. It was only in writing up my notes that I realized that instead of doing a 2:1 ratio of the blue and yellow, say to make blue and green, what I should have been blending was the equivalent of a 1:1 ratio of the blue and green to get blue-green. This is actually a ratio of 3:1, which explains why there's such a similarity between some of the secondary and tertiary colors. I'm looking at you, oranges. My plan is to go back with the greens and try it, although the 1 gram increments of my scales is a limiting factor. Let me explain what she's talking about here. What she's talking about is the contrast of proportions, which is described on page 39 in Color and Spinning. Rachel is going to get into this later as she goes through the different contrasts, but I'll give you a quick summary so you know what she's saying. Each hue of the color wheel has a different strength, or what I've been calling strength. Dominance is also a good word for it. A chap named Goethe, or I don't know how to pronounce it, Goethe, sorry, he came up with a numbers-based system that theoretically tells you how to balance different hues. So for example, he gave yellow a 3 and red a 6. So theoretically, you'd need twice as much yellow as red to get a balanced orange. Jackie's playing around here with those numbers. I think that's super fascinating to apply to a color wheel, so way to go, Jackie. Like I said, we're going to get into this topic more later, but I think it's worth mentioning because a lot of the variations that we're seeing in these color wheels come down to the relative dominance of each primary and the proportions in which they're used. So thank you, Jackie, for digging into that topic. Here's Kristen Lynn, who shared on Slack. She says, I went through my Ashford Corriedale stash and tried my best to use Google and match warm RYB and cool RYB. This is my results. Left warm, right cool. I prefer the warm, but before I move into tinting and shading, I'm going to take the cool red and see what it does with the warm yellow and warm blue. Again, while I understand warm and cool, I'm no expert and only going by what my phone screen shows in photos for comparison, which is definitely not accurate. I think it does come through clearly in these pictures. Again, pictures are always limiting, but you can see that it's warmer on the left. If you trace across between each primary, you can see that the blue on the left is more violet, the yellow on the left is warmer and more saturated, and the red on the left is also much warmer. What stands out here to me is the lightness of the yellow on the right, which really lightens the whole palette. And while the more saturated yellow on the left kept the values more middling. It's wonderful the subtle differences you got between these different samples, between these two wheels, Kristen. Great job. Okay, next we have Mary Jo, or MJM, on Ravelry, who she also posted a color wheel back in January. She says, I decided to make a pastel color wheel using this roving that was a weird advent calendar from 2021. I started by separating the colors on my blending board and then 5 passes on my combs to blend. So it ended up a lovely pastel wheel of color and a little puff of fiber to the side, which was the waste from the combs blended together to see if I had mud. So I love how she just made do with what she had in this braid. That was great. I'm not sure if it's the lighting, but the pictures that I'm looking at show a very warm, earthy color wheel. I'm seeing a warmer red and a more greenish blue, and those blend together to make a very mauvey purple. It's possible that if I saw these in different light, they would look more pastel, but we're working with the limits of technology. It's a really beautiful experiment, Mary Jo. Finally, we have Sarah N., who says, here is my first attempt at a color wheel. I've used tops, yellow, scarlet, red, and royal blue as the primaries, as that is what I had. I did 10 grams each with 20% increments and blended using hand carders. I'm actually really pleased with the result. But if I want to keep such samples as records to reproduce colors, I will dye fleece the primary colors using landscape dyes, as that is what is readily available to me at Guild. However, using the tops has now got me started. It's just easier sometimes to start with what you have rather than getting into a whole big process, because then you can find out if you like it and build on what you're learning. So wonderful job, Sarah. It looks great. So looking at all these color wheels together, I made two slides here, one with the CMY, some of the CMY color wheels, and another with the RYB ones. The variations we're seeing between all these color wheels come down to a few different factors. First of all, it's about those different primaries. How dominant are they? How saturated are they? The dominance of a color has to do with its temperature and saturation. Cooler colors tend to be more dominant than warmer colors, and more saturated hues are more dominant than less saturated. Second of all, it's about the relationships between the primaries. As Amanda put it, do those primaries lean towards each other, or do they lean more away from each other? If they lean toward each other, like if a red and a yellow are both warm, there will be a smoother, brighter gradient between them. If they lean away from each other, like a warmer blue and a cooler red, they will make duller secondaries and tertiaries between them, and it will take more steps between them to get a smooth gradation. Third, it's about proportions. Because of that question of dominance, if you make a 50-50 blend between each primary, you won't necessarily get a true secondary. You'll get a tertiary leaning towards whichever primary is more dominant. As we've all discovered, experimenting with proportions is the best way to find exactly the blended color or gradation that we want. So thank you to everybody. You all did amazing work. I hope you enjoyed looking at each other's work and learning from the subtle variations that we each got. I think we're all discovering that there's really no substitute for doing it yourself. But sharing our work and having those points of reference, I think helps us to build on each other's knowledge. So while we're sort of stepping back, I wanted to talk about something that has started to percolate through the community, which is the question of how are we going to use all of these samples? This is definitely something I think about a lot. When I did the 51 yarns spin along, I really liked having those samples, but they just sat around for a long time, and I like to put my samples to work. So I am definitely already thinking about that. I think I've started collecting pattern ideas. I've started making a bundle on Ravelry of some patterns I would think about. So I thought I'd share with you a few of the patterns that I have percolating through my mind that I'm thinking about. First off, I'm thinking about blankets. I am a card-carrying Kate Davies cult member, so a lot of my ideas are going to be her patterns. But this is one that I really love. It's called Skep. And there's also Starry, which is very quilt looking. These I really like because, all of my pattern ideas involve putting colors together with a neutral like white or cream or black to let those different colors really shine. Although doing a gradation is also an awesome way to do it. Perfectly valid. So I've thought about doing a blanket with, different, they might be smaller, much smaller hexagons than what you see here. And the stars would be much, much smaller. That's one thing I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about hats with pops of color, like this one. I like how you can really see the stripes of color very clearly in this hat. I've also thought about just doing squares or strips for blankets or hats. So, taking, this isn't a great example, but say taking one of my value scales and just knitting it into a strip. Just knitting it into a strip of a certain length, and then if I take strips together, I can sew them together and pull them at the top, and then I've got a hat. Or if I just have a whole bunch of strips, if they're the same width, I could sew them together into a kind of patchwork blanket kind of thing. In order to make my life a little bit easier, to make my samples a little bit more usable in the long term, I am keeping my, yarns to the same general kind of gauge, and I'm basically making worsted weight singles and some DK weight 2-ply, so that just to make it easier to use them together. And most of my fiber is pretty similar, and that just I am thinking ahead about how I'm going to use these, because I don't personally, if you want to keep your samples for reference as yarn, like, that's awesome. I have very, very limited space, and I really want to put my samples to work as stuff. So I am thinking about that. And many of us have paid good money for mini skein sets. Like, we're basically making mini skein sets here. So any of the many, many patterns that are out there which cater to mini skein sets are great starting points for ideas. We may need to massage the numbers or make things smaller for really small samples like this, but there's a ton of ideas out there for ways we can use our samples. So don't be afraid to talk about that. If you're interested, let's keep talking about it and collect patterns that we think would work. All right. Well, that was a lot of talking. Congratulations. We have made it through the first quarter of our year of color. I have really enjoyed carding and talking about these color wheels with you. We're going to be moving on next to talk about hand combs next time. So stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for sharing your work. Please continue to do so. Wherever you are at with the year of color, please feel free to just jump in and do whatever inspires you. It doesn't have to be a color wheel. It doesn't have to be a value scale. We are all at very different places with color. Some of us have a lot of experience with other art media, working with color. So wherever you're at, whatever you want to learn, start there and share. All right. That's enough for now. Have a great day and happy spinning. Bye-bye.